Hey guys, welcome to this tutorial. So today I'm going to show you how to write code to use NSAutolayout. So what does that mean? Well, if you're an iOS developer, you probably heard of autolayouts. It's a library that was made available by Apple since iOS 6 that allows you to lay out your user interface as opposed to using the traditional way of specifying frames for your views. Now, there are a lot of tutorials out there that teach you how to use auto layouts by using Interface Builder, but there's not that many tutorials that teach you how to write code to lay out your views. And if you don't like using Interface Builder like me, I hope you'll find this tutorial helpful. So I'm going to be running this tutorial by creating a demo project in Xcode, and I'll write some code and explain it to you guys. This is also my first tutorial, so if there's anything I could do better or if you guys have any feedback, please leave a comment and let me know, and I'll try to improve next time. So let's go ahead and create our new project. So I'm going to create a single view application in Swift, and I'll call it autolayout demo. So we have our project ready. We have our app delegate and we have our view controller, which is a boilerplate code given to us from Xcode. Let's go ahead and remove the code that we don't need. I think I specified create a new core data project, and that's why it's got all this boilerplate on how to access core data, but I'm just going to remove all that because we don't actually need that. So we've got a clean app delegate and we have our view controller. Let's run the project to make sure that everything works. And yep, everything seems to be working. Now, if you were using Interface Builder, you would probably have a viewcontroller.xib file, and that Interface Builder file would be the view for the view controller. But as we're not using Interface Builder, we're going to be creating our views through code. So let me go ahead and show you guys how to do that. If I go New File, click a class, and I'm just going to create a view called View, which is a subclass of UI View. And here we have our view, which is a subclass of UI View. So how do we actually use this view in the view controller? Well, usually if we had an interface builder file, Xcode would take care of that for us. But as we're not using interface builder, we have to do it ourselves. So in every view controller, we can override a function called loadView. Let's go ahead and do that. So what does this function do? Well, it lets us set up our view for the view controller. And if you were using Interface Builder, Xcode would run this function and set it up for you. But as we're doing it ourselves, we have to override the function. So I'm going to set the view controller's view to view, which is the class that we just created here. So let's go ahead and run that code to make sure that everything has worked. And it seems to have worked, because as you can see, previously we had a white background for the view. But now because we're using our own view and we haven't specified what background color it is, it would default to clear color, and that's why we're seeing the black background here. Next up, let's go and customize our view to give it some color other than clear color, just to prove to you guys that I'm not lying. So I'll override the view's init function, and I'll call superinit, and I'm going to give the view a background color of red. So there's a warning in Xcode, and let's see what that is. Right, I also have to require override init with coder, which is what is required when I override init. There's one other function which I have to override, which is init with frame, because what Cocoa actually does on the background is that when you override init, super init actually calls init with frame, and I have to override that because I've override init. So let's go ahead and do that, and I'm just going to call the default init. So let's run that and see that it's working. I should get a red view, and I have. So that's good. Let's go ahead and change our view color back to white color, just so that it's a little bit easier to see things. Let's run our code to check that it's worked. I have a habit of running code every time I make a little change. I think it's a good habit to get into just so that you can see that what you're writing is actually working and you're not causing any bugs. So that's worked. So let's get down to the exciting part of the tutorial, which is showing you guys how to use auto layouts through code. So the first example I'm going to show you guys is just creating a single view and adding it as a subview of this view. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a view called blue view because I'm going to give it a background color of blue, and it's going to be a subclass of UI view. I'm going to write a function called setUpView, which is called after init, and that's just going to set up our view. So in this function, let's go ahead and initialize our blue view. And usually you would say init with frame, but because we're using auto layouts, we're not actually going to use frames, so I'm just going to call the view's default initializer. In Objective-C, this would just be UI view alloc init. The next thing we have to do is set a few properties on blue view. So let's go ahead and give it a background color of blue. We also have to set one other property, which is translates auto resizing mask into constraints. This might sound like a very complicated thing and a very fancy method, but what it's really doing is that when you use frames, you use auto resizing masks to resize the view based on its layout, orientation, which could be portrait or landscape. And when you use constraints, we don't want to use auto layout masks. We want to have control of that because we're constraining the views. So I'm just going to set that to false. The next thing we have to do is add the view as a subview to this view. So let's go and do that. So I'm just going to do self.add subview blue view. Let's go ahead and check to see that's worked. So I've got a white view and I don't have anything showing up here, and that's because I haven't given it any constraints yet. So let's go ahead and do that next. So there are two main ways to do this. The first way is to create some constraints in code, put those constraints into a variable, and add those variables as constraints to the view. The view would then take those constraints and lay out a subview, which in this case is blue view. The second way is to use a meta language which has been created by Apple to create these constraints. So in the meta language, you basically specify a string and would take that string and process it and create the constraints for you. It's a markup language, kind of similar to HTML in a way, I guess. And this way is a very fast and efficient way to create constraints. And it's also very readable by humans. So I'm going to show you how to create constraints in both ways in this demo. So let's go ahead and get started with the first way, which is creating some constraints and putting them into variables and adding those constraints to the view. So for this example, I'm going to create a view of 200 by 200 pixels, and I'm going to center it to its super view. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, I'm going to create the constraints that is going to center the blue view. So that's going to be done by creating two constraints. One is center X and one is center Y. So firstly, I'm going to create the center X constraint. So to create the constraint, I'm going to use the NSLayout constraint class, which is a class given by the Apple SDK. And what this class does is it gives us convenience methods to create a constraint object. In this case, I'm going to call the initializer for the class. Now, this initializer takes in a variety of parameters, and I'll go ahead and try to explain what each parameter means. So the first parameter, item, is the object that we want to constrain. The second parameter, attribute, is the attribute of the item that we want to constrain. The third parameter, related by, is how we want to relate the item to another item, which would be another view. And the next parameter, toItem, is the view that we want to constrain the first view to. And next we have attribute again, which is the attribute of this item over here. And then we have the multiplier and the constant. It might sound a little bit confusing right now, but I'll show you in the example and hopefully that clears things up. So firstly, we have to specify the first parameter, item. And in this case, we just want to create a constraint for the blue view. And we want to center this blue view. So the attribute would be the center X of the view. So all I have to do is type NSAutolayout attribute dot center X. And I want this to be equal to the center X of its super view because I'm trying to center it. So the related by would be NSLayout relation dot. And see the other options I have greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. In this case, I just want it to be equal to. And toItem, I want it to be equal to its super view. So in this case, it'll be self because I added blue view as a subview to self. And the attribute for self would also be NSLayout attribute center X. And the multiplier and the constant basically says how much of a difference I want the center X of the blue view to differ from the center X of its super view. So if I specified that as 2.0 and 200, basically what that's going to do is it's going to say take the center X of the blue view and it should be equal to the center X of its super view multiplied by 2 plus by 200. But in this case, I want it to be equal to the center. So in this case, I'd have a multiplier of 1, and the constant would be 0. So what this would mean is I want the blue view's center X to be equal to the super view, which is self, center X, multiplied by 1, added by a constant of 0, which would make them the same. Now I'm going to go ahead and create the Y constraint. It's going to be very similar to the X constraint, so I'm just going to copy paste this line of code. And all I have to do is change center X to center Y. So let's go ahead and run that and see if it's worked. Sorry, so I haven't actually added the constraints to the view itself, so let me go ahead and do that. So I can use self.add constraint, center X constraint, and self.add constraint, center Y constraint. So now I've added these two constraints to the view, and the view should use these constraints to lay out its blue view, and it should center it. So let's go ahead and see if that's worked. So as you can see, we've still just got the plain old white view here with no blue view. And why is that? Well, we haven't actually given a height or a width to the blue view. And as I said earlier, we're going to give it a height and a width of 200 by 200. And after we give that, it should appear on the white view. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create two more constraints, one for the width of the blue view and one for the height of the blue view. Again, I am going to call the initializer for NSLayout constraint. And we want to constrain the blue view, and this time we want to constrain the attribute of its width. And it should be equal. Now, here we're just trying to give the blue view a constant width of 200. And in that case, we don't want to constrain it to any other item. It's not relating to any other item. It just relates to itself, and it wants a constant of 200. So in this case, I'm just going to specify nil for toItem, and attribute should be not an attribute because there's no item, so there's also no attribute. The multiplier should be 1.0, and as I want to give it a constant width of 200, all I have to do is specify 200. Now I'm going to go ahead and create the height constraint. So once again, I'm just going to copy and paste the code above, and I'm going to change that to height. And now I have to add the two constraints to the view. And let's see if that's worked. So as you can see, I have a blue view and I have it centered in the X and Y directions, and it's a 200 by 200 square view. So over here I've added each constraints individually to self, which is the view, but actually we can improve that a little bit. There's another method on the view called add constraints instead of constraint, and in this case you can just provide an array of the constraints that you want to give the view. So let me go ahead and do that. I have to give it all the constraints, which is center X, center Y, the width, and the height. And by doing that, I can now remove these 4 lines of code and use this line as a substitute. So I should end up with the exact same result as what I currently have on the simulator. So let's go ahead and give that a go. And as you can see, we have the exact same result and less lines of code. So that's pretty much how you would go ahead and create constraints for a single view. You can create the width and height constraint to give it some width and height, and then you can give some other constraints to tell its super view where to put it. But more often is the case where you would want multiple views in your application. So for this next example, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to do that. I'm going to create another view called red view this time, and I'm going to give it a dimension of 100 by 100, and I'm going to put it directly above this blue view with the same center. So I'm going to center the red view on the screen. So let's go ahead and create our red view. We're going to set it up, and the setup will be very similar to blue view. I also have to give it a background color. This time it's going to be red. And I also have to set the translates auto resizing mask on the view to false. So if I go ahead and run this code now, I shouldn't actually see anything because I haven't defined any constraints on the red view. So as you can see, that's correct. The red view is already a part of its super view, but it doesn't have a frame and it doesn't have an origin, so we can't really see anything on the screen. So let's go ahead and give the red view some constraints. So let's go ahead and create our red view. We're going to set it up, and the setup will be very similar to blue view. I also have to give it a background color. This time it's going to be red. And I also have to set the translates auto resizing mask on the view to false. So if I go ahead and run this code now, I shouldn't actually see anything because I haven't defined any constraints on the red view. So as you can see, that's correct. The red view is already a part of its super view, but it doesn't have a frame and it doesn't have an origin, so we can't really see anything on the screen. So let's go ahead and give the red view some constraints. First of all, let's give it a width and a height. So as this is going to be very similar to the setup for the blue view, I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste that code. And I'm going to name it the red view width constraint. and the red view height constraint. And I just have to change the item to red view. And as I said, I wanted to give it a dimension of 100 by 100. So let's just go ahead and change the constant to 100 by 100. Next up, let's go ahead and give the red view some origin constraints. So as I said earlier, I want to center the red view on the screen, just like the blue view. I could go ahead and do exactly what I did with the blue view by constraining its center X to its super view's center X. But there's also another way to do it, and that's by centering the red view's center X to the blue view's center X. And that way, if the blue view's center X ever moves, the red view's center X would also move with it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create the red view center X constraint. And I'm going to call the initializer for NSLayout constraint again to help me create the constraint. So this time the item would be red view. And the attribute that I want to lay out would be the center X. And I want it to be equal to the blue view center X, so the related by would be NSLayout relation equal. And the to item would be the blue view, because I want to constrain it to the blue view's center X. The NSLayout attribute would be center X, with a multiplier of 1 and a constant of 0, because I don't want it to be offset by any amount from the blue view center X. So now we've got our red view center X constraint, but we don't have the constraint for the Y position of the red view. So let's go ahead and do that. So to do that, I mentioned previously I wanted the red view to sit exactly on top of the blue view. So how would we do that using constraints? Well, if we think about it, if one view sits exactly on top of another view, then that means the bottom of the red view would equals to the top of the blue view. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to call this one the red view bottom Y constraint. And actually it should just be called bottom constraint because it's the bottom of the view. And the NSLayout constraint initializer this time would also be red view for the item. And the attribute should be NSLayout attribute. And I want to constrain the bottom of the red view. So instead of center Y or center X, this time I'm going to specify bottom. And I want it to be equal to the top of the blue view. So I'll go ahead and say NSLayout relation equal. And as I want to constrain it to the top of the blue view, the two items should be blue view, and the attribute should be the top. And I want to give it again a multiplier of 1 and a constant of 0 because I don't want it to be offset by any amount. So let's go ahead and add those constraints to our super view. Add constraints. So I have to add the red view center X constraint and the bottom constraint and its width constraint and its height constraint. So let's go ahead and run our code, and we should see the red view sitting exactly on top of the blue view with a 100 by 100 pixel dimension, and it should be centered. And as you can see, that is the case. We have our red view over here, and it's directly on top of the blue view, and it's centered in the X direction. And the bottom of the red view is equals to the top of the blue view. So that's pretty much how you would constrain two views to each other. And before we move on to the next example, let's just go ahead and refactor this code a little bit. So here I've called the red view center X constraint. I should, just for consistency, I should also call this blue view center X constraint. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's just check that we haven't broken anything and everything still looks the same as before. And everything is the same as before. We still have our red view and our blue view. So before we move on, let's go ahead and play with some of these variables. So here I've got a multiplier of 1 and a constant of 0. So what if I wanted to offset the red view center X by 100 pixels from the blue view center X? Well, let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to change the constant to 100. And as you can see, the center X of the red view is now 100 pixels away from the center X of the blue view. And now let's say I want the red view's bottom constraint. I want the bottom of the red view to be where the top of the blue view is multiplied by 0.5. So let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see, the bottom of the red view is now where the blue view was, but multiplied by half the distance. And that's placed the red view on the top right of the screen. So that was just a quick demonstration to show you guys how the multiplier and constant worked. I know I've already explained it, but I thought I should just change the values around just to give you guys an idea of how everything would work. So that's pretty much it for the first way of setting up auto layout constraints. The second way is to use the meta language which has been created by Apple, and that makes the code a lot more readable. So here you see I've got the blue center X constraint, center Y, width, and height, and this is quite a lot of code. And I don't really want to write this much code every time I need to use auto layouts. So I know at the beginning of this video I said I'm going to provide two demos. One is to show you guys how to set up constraints in this way, and the second was to set up constraints using the meta language. But the video is running quite lengthy. I think it's currently at 30 minutes. So I'm actually going to cut the video short and provide that in a separate tutorial. So if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and any feedback or anything that I could improve on, please leave it in the comments below, and I'll try to improve that on my next tutorial. I'm also going to put the sample code on my GitHub page, and I'll provide a link for that in the video description below. Feel free to use it, to copy it, and do whatever you want with it. So yeah, that's pretty much it for today, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time.